Well, I think the connection between memory politics in particular and democracy is incredibly important. I think particularly today, we see memory politics manifesting in various ways. And when we say democracy, by the way, I think very often we forget that adjective, liberal, when we talk about the noun of democracy. And this is very important because, of course, we would like to think, I think those of us who are committed Democrats, of which I'm certainly one, that in a democratic society, memory should be pluralistic, memory should be contentious, but not in a way that leads to political violence. In other words, it could be something that could be discussed in a civilized fashion, in a routinized, institutionalized fashion. But all too often what we're seeing today, I believe, is the use of memory for illiberal projects. And oftentimes, and this is really important to emphasize, this is carried out under the guise of democracy as well. So there is this important distinction to be made between liberal democracy and majoritarian democracy. And unfortunately, from my perspective, what we're seeing more and more of is majoritarian democracy in places like Hungary, in places like Poland, and various other countries, particularly, although not exclusively, in Central and Eastern Europe. This is manifesting in the rise of populism. This is manifesting in the rise of xenophobia. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. So I began work in this field by looking at the rise of memory laws, which was very interesting to me, that the first formal Holocaust denial law was only passed in the mid-'80s in West Germany at the time, even before Israel actually had one. Israel passed one year later. But these early laws had a very different intent than many of the later memory laws. And I'll connect this to democracy in a moment. But the early laws were really about taking what society had already worked through in a fairly organic way, at least societal elites, not just political, but I mean cultural and economic and so on, and enshrining it to avoid the violation of a taboo. So I think we can all agree that there's nothing particularly productive to be had by having a conversation of the Holocaust denial, right? This is not part of the panoply of legitimate opinion that we want heard in academic settings or in societal settings. But where this differs, and where a very interesting thing happened, if you will, with the expansion of the EU, particularly in 2004, the really large expansion where the 8 new post-communist countries joined the EU, you had something that happened that really changed the way memory politics in Europe were playing out. So one of the implicit goals of getting these countries into the EU was that they also recognize more overtly the role of the Holocaust. And this is a very good thing in many ways. And for the most part, they did. But then countries like Poland, like Slovakia, like Czechia, they turned around and they said, well, you have to also recognize the suffering that we endured, particularly the suffering under the communist regime. This was actually one of the most formative events in my lifetime, was when I went to Poland as a much younger man, but about 20 years ago now, and found a distant relative of my wife, and he still had, the pillboxes, the German pillboxes in his field. He was a farmer. And I asked him what it was like under, he was a much older man, I asked him what it was like under German occupation and Soviet occupation. He said Germany was bad, but the Soviet Union was worse. And that's such a different narrative than what we in the West, certainly what I as someone from the United States was used to. So once these countries joined the EU, many of them started trying to have this other narrative recognized. So this equivalency, what Hannah Arendt called the twin totalitarianisms, and Francois Furet talks about this as well. And they've met some success, as you know. So there was the Vilnius Declaration. There was recently, I believe it was in September of 2019, the EU passed a resolution essentially equally blaming Soviet Russia or Soviet Union, I should say, and Germany for starting World War II. And of course, Russian President Vladimir Putin responded by stating that, well, it was really Poland's fault for taking a piece of territory. as a result of the Munich Agreement of 1938, which Poland was not even a signatory to. This is, of course, what allowed Germany to seize the Sudetenland. But the connection here to memory laws is, I think, memory, and particularly its legislative embodiment, has been really weaponized. So it's gone from something that's meant to help you avoid societal taboos to something that's in political play, particularly by nationalists, by right-wing parties. And we've really seen the shift. We've seen the people pushing for memory laws shift from the political left, so trying to make this noxious memory, let's say, of Nazism inaccessible politically in the present day, to having what I call in my own work prescriptive memory laws. So having memory laws put into place surrounding events that maybe don't have yet a full societal consensus around them, as a means of competing in the political process against opponents on the other side of the ideological spectrum. So this is what is particularly concerning to me today about the connection between democracy and memory politics. Is I just want to ask, whose democracy are we talking about? Are we talking about a democracy that is pluralistic, that is inclusive, that allows multiple narratives to be heard? These are all very good things. Or are we talking about a democracy where one narrative is privileged about others, and it becomes not about the memory of the victims of the state, but it becomes about glorifying either the state or the nation? And I think that's really important to make that distinction, because from a normative perspective, the outcomes of these different ways of looking at the past are quite different. So memory laws are legislative acts or statutes, or in some cases resolutions. In a pure definition of them, they are laws that impose punitive sanctions, so either monetary fines or even jail sentences in some cases. If we think of them more broadly, we could think of them as more declarative statements. So the government officially recognizes something. We can have a discussion about what this means for democracy, because of course there's a freedom of speech aspect to this, which is also a little bit concerning if we're saying that you can only talk about the past in this particular way, particularly if we're applying a criminal penalty for a violation of this. Maybe this isn't surprising, as I'm from the United States, but I tend to privilege free speech. Having said that, the goals of these laws can be either to create more pluralistic discourse, to create more pluralistic discussions, to protect the victims, or again, to allow for political competition to take place through other means. Because oftentimes, I think memory serves as a very convenient political tool, because it becomes a proxy for a whole host of other associations. I can, talking about my own country, I can say we should ban displays of the Confederate flag. And that carries a particular valence with certain populations, right? There are assumptions made about other political issues and my views on them simply based on my stance. To me, this is problematic, because this doesn't leave a lot of room for nuance. And that's essentially what I'm most concerned with, is that once we go beyond nuance, once we legislate the way we can talk about the past and say you can't talk about it this way, but you can talk about it this way, we lose that ability for discussion. But it's a complicated question, because of course there are positions and there are views out there that properly are settled matters. The Holocaust happened. We can't have a discussion about this, because a fact is a fact. So finding this balance between objective truth, and I'm an empirical positivist enough to believe that that exists, and our subjective interpretations of it, and where the boundaries lie about what is accepted speech, is a very difficult and fraught undertaking. I would draw in my own mind a distinction between what I've called proscriptive memory laws. So again, these laws where historians have settled the matter. The Holocaust happened. And we can make a case for protecting the memory of the victims, or the memory, or not memory, but the feelings of their descendants. I have much less, maybe even no problem with those laws, although they do violate freedom of speech, certainly. I think we have to recognize that. But what concerns me, and why I'm a little bit afraid of such laws, is all of the prescriptive memory laws. So again, these kind of ideas that haven't yet been fully discussed academically, which haven't become settled matters. So the Polish famous law of 2018 to protect the good name of the Polish people, right? On the surface, the law made a lot of sense. You know, these were not Polish death camps. Stop calling them Polish death camps. You sound idiotic when you call them Polish death camps. World leaders, including, you know, my own president, Barack Obama at the time, said this. But on the other hand, the goal of this law was to protect the memory of the nation and the state, not the memory of the victims. And that's really what concerns me. I mean, you see these same dynamics playing out in Hungary, where essentially, if you look particularly at some of the memorial culture that's risen up, you would almost think that Hungary was one of the main victims of Nazi Germany. Well, what's the problem with that? Hungary was an ally of Nazi Germany, right? But this kind of whitewashing is very effective politically. And we see this, by the way, also with the communist regime. A lot of the East Central European countries are very inclined to whitewash or completely write out their own co-ethnics who were willing accomplices with communism, and to make it seem as if this is just an imposition from the Soviet Union. Now, of course, this was an imposition from the Soviet Union, but there were also people who were genuinely convicted communists in Poland, in Hungary, in Czechia, in Slovakia. And it does nothing to the veracity of historical studies to forget this. But politically, it's a very useful thing to do. Well, I don't think it's right now. I think this phenomenon has been building for some time. But you're quite right. It's broader. I mean, in the 1990s, Pierre Nora said that legislating memory is a distinctly French political sport. It's no longer that. As for what's driving it, I think the lack of ideological bifurcation that was caused by the Cold War is significant in this respect. I think having what were historically the subalterns, so that, again, the countries of Central and Eastern Europe now have a supranational stage in Europe, meaning the EU and other organizations on which to express their opinions. This is why I mentioned the 2004 accession as being so important, because all of these countries said, yes, we'll recognize the Holocaust. And then once they were in the EU, they said, now you, West, you have to recognize our suffering, which you've glossed over for so long. And I think, frankly, it has to do with more of a feeling of existential dread and anxieties arising from globalization, from sort of the failure of the neo-economic model. I think we can't divorce all of these currents, you know. I think in particular, economics is driving a lot of the populism that we see, and the use of memory by populists is simply a very effective tool to raise people's passions. You know, if you ask me, do I have opinions about my tax rate? Yeah, of course I have opinions about my tax rate, but this doesn't make me very passionate. If you tell me that the people who killed my grandfather actually weren't such bad people, I'm going to have a very, very strong response to that. I'm going to have a very emotional response to that. And that's why they use these memory politics.